Okay, so I chose for my FTO the Moroccan Islamic Combatant Group, but their area is a francophone part of the world, so they call it the Group Islamique Combatant Marocain. Maybe. All right, so their goals. Their goal is to install an Islamic fundamentalist regime in Morocco. They have cells in Western Europe and in French Canada, indicating that the group may also want to establish regimes over there as well, or just to get support from more wealthy Western patrons. Their history. They are one of the many North African terror groups created during the Taliban's rule of Afghanistan in the 1990s. They fought against the Soviet Union. They did a lot of the things that Al-Qaeda, or they participated in a lot of the things that created Al-Qaeda. Some of the members were actually members of Al-Qaeda to begin with, or whatever the foundation of Al-Qaeda was before Al-Qaeda became Al-Qaeda. Because of their ideology, around 2002, the U.S. froze their assets, or the group's assets, from a year. I think it should be an UN resolution. It's EU or EO on whatever website I got it from. But a UN resolution that targeted terror groups and froze their accounts. And they were one of the groups that were chosen. And after a few terrorist attacks, they were designated a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. in 2005. One of the terrorist attacks that they did was they attacked the city of Casablanca, and 12 suicide bombers killed 45 people. It was a pretty big attack, and that was in that area, so that was like one of their domestic strikes. This is the first known attack by this group. The second major attack they did were the Madrid bombings. They were connected to these bombings through a offshoot organization that has a very similar name, actually. In fact, Danny, I think you were covering this group. Yeah, I think it might have been that. Tied to the Madrid transportation attacks in 2004, they killed 191 people and wounded almost 2,000 people. And it was conducted by Salafia Jahida, and I think your group was involved too. That was like their biggest one. And are they linked to Al-Qaeda? Indeed. GICM is a documented affiliate group of Al-Qaeda. Everyone knows this. CIA, all the sites I went to said it was. Its roots are in Afghanistan. It has the same origins. They strive to achieve similar goals. So, in my opinion, yes, they are in fact linked to Al-Qaeda. And that's it. It was a pretty small group, so small.
I can go next if no one feels strongly about.
Okay, for some reason it's like.
Is the video camera still going strong?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay.
That's why I had to put the French in there, because it actually.
Geography, groups, relationships.
Okay. Is everybody good to go? Like done with the assessment? Okay. So my FTO is called Ansar al-Islam, and it's a terrorist organization based in Iraq. And so the organization's main goal is to eradicate Western influence in Muslim lands, but it also wants to institute Sharia law throughout Iraq. The organization claims to be Sunni, and its ideology closely resembles that of Wahhabism. Geography, the organization was founded in the area between Iraqi Kurdistan and Iran, although it primarily operates in northern and central Iraq now, which is kind of shown by the orange sector of the map. A lot of members are believed to currently reside outside of Iraq and Iran after a U.S. Special Forces operation in 2003 kind of sought to dismantle the organization and cause some of its members to scatter. But despite that, the organization is not believed to operate heavily outside of Iraq. And then Ansar al-Islam is responsible for the second largest number of terrorist attacks in Iraq, second only to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And is accused of various car bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations. So some of its more notorious attacks are in 2004. It's believed to have bombed a U.S. Department of Defense office in Mosul, which resulted in 22 casualties. And in 2003, it's thought to have, it bombed a military base, not a DoD office. And then in 2003, it's believed to have bombed a DoD office in Erbil, which resulted in 3 deaths. And then it's not confirmed, but some people think that Ansar al-Islam may have been involved in a plot to bomb a NATO summit meeting in Istanbul in 2004. And then so Ansar al-Islam primarily targets coalition forces. It also heavily targets individuals who support coalition forces, Iraqi government and security forces, and different political parties within Iraq, especially the secular Iraqi Kurds and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And then Ansar al-Islam justifies the attacks by claiming that the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq in 2003 and that the invasion has resulted in thousands of Iraqi deaths. And thus, similar to Al-Qaeda, they argue that it's the duty of every Muslim to expel Western influence from Muslim land and from Iraq. So kind of a brief history of the organization. It has its roots in a different organization called Jund al-Islam, which means Soldiers of Islam. And in September 2001, this organization took control of a small cluster of villages near Halabja in Iraq, and they instituted Sharia law there. A couple months later, in December 2001, the organization merged with a group of separatist Kurdish rebels who supported the Islamic movement of Kurdistan. And when these two movements merged, they formed Ansar al-Islam, and their leader was Mullah Qatar, which is that man right there. And then in 2003, just immediately prior to the U.S. invasion, the U.S. sent special forces to Afghanistan with the purpose of dismantling Ansar al-Islam, which kind of dealt a blow to the organization. In 2003, their first leader, Mullah Qatar, was forced to flee the country to Norway. And so Abu Abdullah al-Shafi'i took control of the organization. In 2004 was when it was named an FTO by the State Department. And then in 2007, Ansar al-Sunnah, which is another somewhat significant terrorist organization, claimed that it was an offshoot of Ansar al-Islam. And then May 4th, 2010, the organization's second leader, Abu Abdullah al-Shafi'i, was captured near Baghdad. And so, does the organization have ties to Al-Qaeda? Yes, it does. Mullah Qatar, who was the founder of the organization, is believed to have founded Ansar al-Islam with logistical support and funding from bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Also in 2003, the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee placed Ansar al-Islam on a list of organizations that has ties with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or bin Laden. Also, many members of Ansar al-Islam are believed to have trained with members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And Ansar al-Islam is believed to have sheltered members of Al-Qaeda who were fleeing from Afghanistan in northern Iraq. And that's Ansar al-Islam.
Yeah, I'll go. Here. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. This week's reading will be super important, guys. By the way, I'm not coming to class.
Okay, so my presentation is on Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, which translates to the Islamic group, and it's Egypt's largest militant Islamist group, and in a few minutes I'll tell you why militant is in parentheses. And its main goal is to replace Egypt's secular government with an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law, and its leaders include Mustafa Hamza, Rafai Taha Musa, and Sheikh Omar Abdel al-Rahman, whose name might sound familiar because he made a quick appearance in the Looming Tower. He was imprisoned at the same time as Zawahiri, and he and his group, Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, were sort of seen as kind of the rival organization to Zawahiri's Al-Jihad. And even though the two groups had the same goal of Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman believed that anybody could embrace Islam and that Islam could be spread to the world in general, whereas Zawahiri practiced a very strict version of Islam, and he sort of worked secretly and aimed to sort of implement his practices by surprise and using force. It has various sources of funding, alleged sources: Iran, Osama bin Laden, several other non-governmental Islamist groups. Its strength is primarily in southern Egypt and Cairo and Alexandria among the university population, especially those who are unemployed. And at its peak, it had thousands of armed members. So it seeks to establish an Islamic rule sort of by any means necessary, and really emphasizes the use of, or at its inception, it emphasized the use of violence, rejecting all sorts of diplomatic compromises. And that's sort of a result of its history. It's a radical offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was created after the Muslim Brotherhood started practicing more peaceful means in order to achieve its goals. So its major influences include Sayyid Qutb, who also was obviously very influential to Al-Qaeda, and Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman. And it targets primarily civilians, anything it sees as symbolic of secular governments, including police officers, bookstores, theaters. It was implicated in the assassination of Anwar Sadat, although it's still unclear to what extent they participated in that. The group worked with Zawahiri's group in the attempted assassination of Hosni Mubarak, and in the 1990s it launched a terrorist campaign that was really characterized by sort of vicious violence, and it culminated in the 1997 Luxor massacre, in which 60 or so tourists, I think, were killed, along with a couple of Egyptians. And this was met with revulsion by Egypt at large, and as a result, the group announced the 1997 Nonviolence Initiative, through which it renounced violence officially. And as you can imagine, this had a very polarizing effect. Zawahiri, who had worked with the group prior to this, said that this was a surrender, and the group itself divided into two separate factions. The peaceful group faction was led by Mustafa Hamza, and Rufai Ahmed Taha led the faction that advocated violence. So links to Al-Qaeda. As you can see from the past slides, Al-Gama and Al-Qaeda had been linked even before Al-Qaeda came to fruition, either through similar ideological influences or through working with prominent Egyptian Islamists who would become crucial in the formation of Al-Qaeda, like Zawahiri. Bin Laden also allegedly funded training camps in Afghanistan, where many of the recruits from Al-Gama al-Islamiyah was trained. And after the group split into two, Rufai Taha signed the Al-Qaeda fatwa saying International Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusades. And in 2006, Zawahiri actually went on camera and said that Al-Gama al-Islamiyah had actually joined Al-Qaeda, and one of its members of Al-Gama al-Islamiyah came on the video to confirm this, although he also said that several of his brothers had backslid and rejected the use of militant violence. So it's really not surprising that many members have come out to deny the claim that Al-Gama al-Islamiyah has merged with Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda's goal is jihad, whereas our goal is Islam. So the group really has split into two. One that has, the smaller radical offshoot has embraced Al-Qaeda and sort of has joined together, but most of the members of the group, including its leaders, have completely rejected the use of terrorism, and the group has officially not committed any acts of terrorism since 1997, although there have been one or two small incidences. And sort of in response to the group's commitment to nonviolence as sort of as an act of good faith, the Egyptian government has released thousands of its members from prison. And the nonviolent faction of Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, which is the majority of the group, has gone so far as to release a book series called Concept Corrections, in which they formally renounce violence and extremist interpretations of Islam. And one of the books is actually called Al-Qaeda Strategies and Bombings, Errors and Dangers. And I guess the most current news on the group is that they're currently trying to form a party called the Building and Development Party as a result of the Arab Spring. So in sum, the group throughout its history has been linked to Al-Qaeda through ideology and its work with members of future members of Al-Qaeda. but as of today, it's split into two separate factions. A much smaller faction that has joined with Al-Qaeda and a much larger faction that is that's completely peaceful. That's it.
I just want to pull up a picture. Yeah, it's not gonna be easy to see that. That's the blue light. Alrighty. I did Hamas, also known as the Islamic Resistance Movement. And I guess I'll start out with the overarching goal of Hamas, which is to liberate Palestine from Israeli occupation, as well as establish an Islamic Palestinian state in place of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And I just want to draw your attention to the map real quick so you can see geographically where they are. It's a lot easier to see this than for me to try to explain it. But yeah, they're basically in Palestine, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan, and Syria. That's their main basis of operation. And like the previous group, they are a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the Palestinian Sunni political party that governs the Gaza Strip. So it first began in 1987 during the first Intifada, and it was initially led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And the purpose of this movement was to adopt a more nationalistic and activist line. So in 1998, the Hamas charter was issued, and just a couple quotes from that charter that I found interesting. It said that peaceful solutions and the international conferences to resolve the Palestinian problem are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement. For renouncing any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion. And then the second interesting part was they blamed Israel for the French and communist revolutions and claimed that they stood behind World War II. So they blamed the Jews for World War II, which go figure on that one. So they carried out their first attack against Israel in 1989 by abducting and killing 2 Israeli soldiers. The military wing of Hamas, I'm not going to try to pronounce it too much, but it's the Al-Qassam brigades, which are universally known for their suicide bombers. They refer to themselves as students of Ayasha, who is a Hamas bomb maker, student of the engineer. That's what it stands for. And the second Intifada began in September of 2000, which resulted in the deaths of 5,500 Palestinians, 1,100 Israelis, and 64 foreigners. So it's an ongoing struggle that continues to kill thousands of people. So as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there is some sort of tie or working with. And there's also a great deal that says that they aren't. First off, they share similar ideological roots, as I talked about in the charter. They both have roots to the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. Top Al-Qaeda leaders as well as top Hamas leaders both kind of came from that. And in the early 1990s, it was said that Hamas members received military training in Sudan alongside bin Laden, and they also received training in Afghanistan in Al-Qaeda camps. There's a well-known terrorist who has ties to Al-Qaeda who also sponsors Hamas. Hamas gets a lot of funding from Iran, who hasn't necessarily been shown to have too many super close ties to Al-Qaeda, but they get a lot of funding from Saudi Arabia as well. And most recently, the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, following the killing of bin Laden, had this to say. He said, "We condemn the assassination and the killing of an Arab holy warrior. We regard this as a continuation of the American policy based on oppression and the shedding of Muslim and Arab blood." So clearly, Hamas and its leader respected and revered bin Laden, thought he was an Arab holy warrior. And lastly, Al-Qaeda, the current Al-Qaeda operations chief began with Hamas. So there's significant ties there. But interestingly, in 2009, there was a clash between Al-Qaeda and Hamas. And it resulted in several of the top leaders actually being killed. So that was the reason for that clash is still kind of unknown and kind of vague. Not too much information on that. But bin Laden al-Zawahiri, before bin Laden died, he was very critical of Hamas, claimed that they were kind of accommodating Israel in the West and for improperly waging jihad. But likewise, Hamas accused bin Laden of kind of trying to infiltrate that region. I think Hamas has a lot of political power and a lot of just power in general in this region, and so Hamas is very kind of protective of their battle with Israel and for the Gaza Strip and West Bank, and they really don't want or need Al-Qaeda's help in that region. So that's kind of been a source of tension. So, does anybody have any questions? All right, thanks.
Yeah, I emailed my thing around if anyone cares to take a look. Doubtful. Okay, so I recently switched groups after picking the same one as Danny on accident. Professor Lowe recommended that I do this one. So it's called Boko Haram, and it is in northeastern Nigeria. That's where they're primarily located. They're located in a specific state. I think it's called Borno. Give me a second. Okay. All right, so they are known by a couple of names, actually. Some of their members have actually said that they have no official name. Other members say that their official name is people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad. The Arabic name translation is just as verbose. They're also locally known as the Taliban. Obviously no relationship to the actual Taliban in Afghanistan. But they were founded by a guy named Mohammed Yusuf in 2002. It was actually founded as a school and mosque in this Maiduguri in Borno, Nigeria. And it was founded as an alternative to local education. The name Boko Haram actually means, colloquially, Western education is a sin. So they really protest the state schools in the area. Nigerian schools aren't that developed in the first place, but where they are, like they have like a stigma attached to them by a lot of Muslims in the area, because when the British occupied Nigeria, they were oftentimes Christian and like tried to convert people who went there. So that's pretty much where their main problem with Nigerian society comes. They're only really located in Nigeria. So we've got a timeline here, founded in 2002. I didn't put that on because there's literally no information on them until 2009, when violence started to come from the group in the area. So we have all these kind of progressively more violent attacks in the area. In 2009, actually, their founder was killed, captured by the army or by the police, and then killed. There was a lot of controversy over like whether or not he was, killed or escape. Most people think that he was just kind of assassinated, essentially. So yeah, the contributing factors to like the development of this organization were like the colonial tensions in like Western government schools in the area, and a lot of people in the area like, opposed going to these schools, and so they sent their children to this school, and it became kind of a recruiting ground for like radical terrorists. So yeah, the schools under the British rule were often Christian, that kind of fell through. The state neglect of education. A lot of sources say that one of the major problems is that like, the government of Nigeria doesn't really focus on education much. So like you have like this kind of like alternative route of education. Extreme poverty. Most of the people that came to this school were from extremely poor families, and it was seen as like the only kind of alternative. And they used like a religious justification to say that it was like the best alternative. Okay, so this is actually like the most interesting source that I found on this group. It's actually like there's not that much information out there, just other than specific attacks that they've carried out. But this is a group of there's 41 different organizations that met in Nigeria to kind of come together and talk about this group and kind of consolidate the information that they knew about them. So they have answers to 26 common questions about the group. And the most interesting that I found, which I've kind of pulled aside here, is on the ideology. I can email this out if anyone's interested. I'll probably email it to Professor Lowe. So from the perspective of the group, like what is the alternative to Western secular education? So their opinion is that essentially an educational system that adheres to only what's provided for in Sharia law. They also note, and most of these are actually really religious groups. There's most of the answers here cite the Quran directly, and they're answering these questions. And even they note that there seems to be like no curriculum available for what they want. So second, other than education, what are their concerns? They basically say anything that is not in accordance with Sharia law is a concern to them. There's a lot of kind of radical quotes out there. They said like they don't believe that water or that rain is like caused by evaporation of water. They believe it was created by God. So kind of like really simplistic arguments sometimes. And then finally, what I thought was most interesting, and this kind of ties into the next slide, relationship to Al-Qaeda was their view on Muslims who do not share their ideology. And so they say, I'm going to read this off here, from the explicit contents of lectures and debates of their leaders and some of their preachers, and from the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, they regard non-believers to be kuffar, or non-members to be kuffar. So this kind of paralleled what the takfiri ideology that we kind of read about in the Looming Tower. And so I thought that was one of the biggest links to Al-Qaeda, but they aren't actually linked to Al-Qaeda. There's been a little speculation recently because their attacks have become more and more like advanced that they're starting to cooperate with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. So that's a possible linkage, but they're extremely new organizations. So I think that kind of needs to flesh out a little bit before we see a direct link. But currently they are unrelated and really only based in Algeria. And even then, they're only really based in the northeastern part of Algeria. Some of their attacks have started to spread to the capital, but most of the violence is located in the northeast, and really just in that city that they were founded in. So yeah, the use of takfiri as a justification of violence, rejection of Western ideology, just complete blanket denial of any kind of Western science, anything not in accordance with Sharia law. They justified their attacks. They say essentially that violence is the only way to shape Western influence and push Sharia law. So their ultimate goal is to have, a very hardline Sharia law in place in Nigeria, which seems to echo a lot of the things we hear in a lot of Bin Laden's speeches about how Sharia law is unacceptable in a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. So that's the end of the presentation. But yeah, as a conclusion, not related to Al-Qaeda, but we may start to see cooperation between the two, and perhaps even a carry on of this pattern that we've seen in the class of non-related local groups claiming affiliation with Al-Qaeda to kind of bolster their ranks and their, I don't know, their sense of legitimacy.
Is that book cam? It didn't turn off or anything, did it?
No, I think we have about 30 minutes left on it.
You want your-
Yeah, that's. Okay, so my group is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and I'm going to explain to you guys today why it is related to Al-Qaeda, besides the obvious that it's in its name. So AQIM for short, 'cause it's kind of a long name, they originated as an armed Islamist resistance movement to the secular Algerian military government. And its insurrection began after Algeria's military regime canceled the second round of parliamentary elections in 1992. And the reason they canceled it was it became clear that the Islamic Salvation Front, which was a coalition of Islamist militants and moderates, might win the election. So they wanted to make sure that didn't happen, and they canceled elections. So then in 1998, the group declared its independence from another terrorist organization group that it was related to, called the Armed Islamic Group. And the reason why they decided to split off from the group was because they didn't like that the other group was killing civilians. So ironically, they ended up doing so. So out of that split, they became the Salafist group for preaching and combat, and the short name for that is GSPC, which goes with their French name. So the group now obviously is called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb because they declared their allegiance to Al-Qaeda as early as 2003, and this is because they already had a lot of influence with Al-Qaeda. So bin Laden had actually funded Algerian Islamists in the 1990s when this whole election thing was going on and the resistance began against the secular government. And then he became really heavily involved with the GSPC's early formation after they split from the Armed Islamic Group. And also many of the group's founding members actually trained in Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. So logically, they declared allegiance to Al-Qaeda in 2003. But in 2006, Zawahiri actually officially approved the merger in a September 11th video in 2006. And since then, they claimed responsibility for all attacks under their new name. So on the surface, they're definitely related to Al-Qaeda, but their goals and their tactics, which I'm going to talk about now, also bear some resemblance. So where they are. So they obviously are an Algerian terrorist group, so they've been traditionally categorized as a strictly domestic insurgency, but they're also in Mali because that's where they like to hold their hostages. And they also use the Sahara Desert for like sanctuaries because there's not much government overlook there, although that is changing. They've also been known to fund suicide bombers and foot soldiers to Iraq, and as part of Al-Qaeda. And the concern is that now that they might be moving towards attacks globally. So what do they want? So originally they wanted just to overthrow the Algerian government and establish an Islamic caliphate, but the fact that they've been folded into the Al-Qaeda network suggests many counterterrorism experts think that they might take up like the banner of global jihad and like collude with Al-Qaeda on like future attacks in North Africa or Western Europe and Iraq. And in fact, they've said so. Their current leader has said, quote, "Our general goals are the same goals of Al-Qaeda the mother." And here he is. This is one of the few pictures that is like approved by AQIM and verified as being members of AQIM. And he's the leader is the fourth from the left in like the lime green turban thing. And they just released this video like a week ago that basically says that the past
last year's achievements in various arenas of jihad and the revolutions in the Arab countries are like a sign that Islam is going to be victorious and like rise to global eminence, and that's going to herald the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate. And he went on to talk about the fact that they're expanding their targets, which was originally just to the Algerian government in France, to include the United States. Okay, so tactics. So they use conventional ambushes and bombing, like a lot of other terrorist groups. But the two things that they have been doing more and more often, suicide bombing and IEDs, many think is like a nod to Al-Qaeda or a desire to emulate Al-Qaeda. There have been some deadly attacks in 2007 and 2008 that killed UN members and military members and policemen, all with suicide attacks and IEDs. And they think this increasing frequency is a sign of them emulating Al-Qaeda. One just unique thing or thing that's made them infamous is they're the ones behind all the kidnappings in North Africa, including the one that killed that British national. This is when an IED blew up. It was filled with nails and killed 16 people, mostly foreigners. So what is the future of this group? So basically, many people suspect that they linked up with Al-Qaeda in the first place because they were trying to reinvigorate their group and like get more followers. And in fact, that's like actually been true. There's been like a surge of renewed and more deadly activity after they linked up. But the fact is, after they linked up, they began to be like severely influenced by the ideas, which you've seen, like the goals have become from local to global, and more like aligned with that of Al-Qaeda, and their tactics have also become more similar. And that experts just think, just by looking at their actions, that they have widening ambitions and that they're trying to pursue like a more global, sophisticated, like well-financed direction in an attempt to like emulate Al-Qaeda and their accomplishments. So basically, the takeaway is they're an Algerian-based terrorist group that is officially associated with Al-Qaeda, and their goals and tactics have merged in some aspects and are merging.
So hey everyone, my FTO is the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. They are loosely connected militant groups that operate in Palestine and Israel. They serve as the militant wing of the Palestinian nationalist organization Fatah, which is sort of Markat Hamas. Fatah is this sort of secular, not a counterpart, more a secular rival to Fatah in the struggle for Palestinian nationalism. So the Al-Aqsa Brigades they're active in Israel and Palestine. They have a few branches in Lebanon, but they don't carry out particularly operations anywhere except for the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel whenever they get a chance. And they've been on the U.S. Terrorist organizations list since 2002. So their origins are from the Second Intifada, which is called was called the Intifada al-Aqsa, which the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is where they get their name. They were mostly street fighters who were sort of adopted into an official capacity by Fatah to serve as soldiers during the Intifada and all the uprising that sort of followed. There wasn't ever, Fatah and Yasser Arafat were very involved in the creation. They provided funding and things like that, though there wasn't ever an official decision by them to create these brigades. They were sort of just adopted from street fighters. After the Intifada sort of tapered out, they started undertaking terrorist attacks against targets in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel whenever they could. They sort of graduated from small arms attacks to suicide bombings and more complicated operations. But they're very decentralized, and that nature became more and more apparent over time, as it was very difficult for them to coordinate, or for Fatah to sort of exercise any central leadership over them. Most of the cells operate independently, and so there were several ceasefires that happened over the years in which certain cells of Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades would ignore the ceasefire and continue attacking. So they're structured, like I said, they're just small groups and cells that are independent, autonomous, armed usually from, they usually get their arms from Fatah or from some other organization, but then plan all their operations and undertake them without any sort of oversight or guidance from them. They are probably about a few hundred strong, no real numbers on them, but they show up in street demonstrations a lot just to sort of put a face, a militant face to Fatah whenever they can. They're loyal to Fatah, but there's no direct control over them. So the relationship sometimes is a little shaky, though they do technically represent Fatah during whatever they're doing. Ideologically, again, there's not one ideology because there's not one central figure or anything like that these Al-Aqsa brigades follow. Since they're related to Fatah, they have sort of their central idea is secular Palestinian nationalism. Sort of, it's not exactly like Hamas's idea of a Palestinian nation state because it doesn't have specific Islamic tinges. There's also, I think, there's evidence that there have been Christians and non-religious members of Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades who've been leaders and undertaken suicide operations. So they have a sort of broad, non-religious idea of a Palestinian nation state. Their main ideological influence and sort of like the figure to which they were most loyal was Yasser Arafat until he died in 2004. He also, I think, was instrumental in providing the first funding to get them weapons and things that they needed to sort of most of the cells at least to really get off the ground. But right now they don't have any single unifying figure, so each of these cells is sort of operating on its own and undertaking attacks wherever it sees the opportunity. Tactics, sort of like a lot of decentralized militant groups, small arms attacks against Israeli forces, particularly those were historically the main tactic during the Intifadas. Sort of moved away from it now, though they still have gunmen occasionally just take attacks against civilians and military alike. They're responsible for a lot of rocket and artillery attacks across from the West Bank and Gaza into Israel. They've been involved in kidnappings where they'll take soldiers or civilians and ransom them for prisoners and things like that. They're very infamous for their suicide bombing. They've undertaken several dozen suicide bombings since around 2002 when they started getting involved in it. They've also used in the past children and women as suicide bombers. So yeah, they have a lot of that's their reputation really is built on the suicide bombing. And again, they attack civilians and military alike for Israelis. They've also attacked Palestinians, rivals in Hamas, and people that they would consider collaborators with the Israelis. So they have, very limited, or not a very limited, scope of who they could attack. All right. There's a little bit on your handout about connection with other terrorist organizations. They have done joint attacks with other organizations, but not at any real great extent. Mostly they're connected to Fatah. Well, they more or less are Fatah. They have kind of a funny relationship with Hamas where they alternately support Hamas's attacks and then do things to goad it and push it the wrong way. Then they also get some funding, I think, from Hezbollah, or there's been evidence of that. Though with Al-Qaeda, there's not any real connection between the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades and Al-Qaeda itself. No evidence of anything organizational, financial, or operational. They've never taken a joint attack with Al-Qaeda or one of Al-Qaeda's affiliates. Most of the funding, like I said, has come from Yasser Arafat or from Fatah, so they have not really needed bin Laden or someone connected to Al-Qaeda to give them funds. Ideologically, they don't have any connection with bin Laden or Al-Qaeda, and that has a lot to do with sort of the way that their conflict is framed. It's not a global focus for Al-Aqsa. They are almost solely concerned with liberating Palestine and driving Israel out of it, establishing a secular state. The secular part's important because they're looking for a nationalist Palestinian state, not an Islamic Palestinian state, which is the opposite sort of what Al-Qaeda and even groups like Hamas are pushing for. They don't have a single ideological leader, so there's no real way for them to derive influence from bin Laden or Al-Qaeda through one person or anything like that. And also, they don't, since they're so close to their conflict, they're in Palestine and the West Bank and things like that, so they don't really need a brand name in order to recruit or gain legitimacy or anything like that. So Al-Qaeda doesn't mean anything, and they wouldn't have to adopt any sort of relationship for any benefit. It wouldn't really do anything to help them out so much. Though I would like to, there is the possibility that some individual cells are influenced by Al-Qaeda, but that's relatively remote, and it would be on sort of an individual basis. As an organization, and again, this is a very loose sort of organization, there's no evidence that Al-Qaeda has had any real connection or influence on the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. Okay, thanks guys.
Is there enough time left to do hers on the thing? So I think it's like an hour limit.
It's at 48 minutes.
Okay, we should be good.
Okay, so I did my project on Hezbollah, and a little background on the group. First, they have 6 names. Sorry.
resistance, the Islamic Jihad, Revolutionary Justice Organization, and the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth. So a little background, it's a Shiite group whose name means Party of God. It is led by Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, who is the third Secretary General for the group. He took over after the second Secretary General was assassinated by Israeli forces. The group was formed in 1982 in response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And they received a lot of their ideological inspiration from Ayatollah Khomeini